Good afternoon, everyone, and delighted to have such a good-sized crowd here this afternoon. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. And prior to coming here to Dartmouth, my wife Judy, where is she? Here. We served together in the United States Foreign Service, the State Department, for 35 years, and I had the pleasure and the honor to end up as the U.S. ambassador to Georgia. And now everybody knows where Georgia is. Very, very surprising for some reason. But anyway, we were there from 1998 to 2001. And I'm very happy today that we could bring a very distinguished group together, my other two colleagues, forget about me, to talk about Georgia, the antecedents, and then to get three perspectives on it from various viewpoints, as I'll explain. But with me are Bill Wohlforth, who's the Daniel Webster Professor of Government and also the chair of the Government Department, who's a very esteemed scholar of Russian foreign policy. And he'll be talking primarily about where Russia is, what's motivating Russia, and what may be going through the minds of Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev. And Bridget Coggins, an assistant professor in the Government Department, is a specialist in the study of secessionist movements. And she will be talking a good deal about the South Ossets and also the Abkhaz, two secessionist areas of Georgia. And I'll start off trying to, just as briefly as I can, give some background to this, and also sort of how the Georgian side has seen this. I would just begin by saying that when my wife and I were in the American Embassy in Moscow in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Georgia was probably number one on our list of the countries that was probably going to fail. It had a civil war going on and also two secessionist wars going on. And the two secessionist wars, if you look up on the map, one was in Abkhazia, which is on the Black Sea, and the other, South Ossetia, which you see hanging down. You can see that both of these areas, touch Russia itself, and also very importantly notice that there is a South Ossetia and also a North Ossetia, which happens to be in Russia. So both of these areas, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, were part of Georgia, but uneasily, even during the Soviet period. They had autonomous status and were not terribly satisfied with it. And at the end of the Soviet period, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, largely because of nationality policy, the governing structures, both in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, really were of local Ossets and Abkhaz. And I might add also that in both of these places, populations are very small. South Ossetia is about 100,000, and about 65,000 of those are South Ossets. And Abkhazia isn't much more, and the Abkhaz don't make up much more of the population. So these are small populations in which both the nominal, lead ethnic group is, not very, very large at all. But when the Soviet Union began to break up, the nationalist movement in Georgia, which was headed by a gentleman who later became their first elected president, Mr. Gamsakhourdia, was an extreme Georgian nationalist, very strong in terms of use of the Georgian language, the religion, cultural artifacts. And he did not have a very high estimate of some of the minority groups, and particularly the Abkhaz and the South Ossets, because he thought really they were opponents of Georgian independence. And the South Ossets and the Abkhaz, for some time at the end of the Soviet period and when the Soviet Union broke up, moved gradually from, emphasis on wanting to use their language. When independence came closer, they moved into passing laws that moved towards their independence. And after the Soviet Union broke up and Georgia became independent, they moved further. There were Georgian reactions to it, and both situations evolved into shooting wars. South Ossetia actually began earlier, even before the breakup of the Soviet Union, and Abkhazia was a little bit later. But the important thing to remember is that the Georgians basically lost both battles. The secessionists de facto, took control of these secessionist areas, not de jure, and that's important. De jure means, recognized by the outside world. They were not, but they regarded themselves as independent and no longer part of Georgia. Russians, and again, this is part of a complex historical background, but Russians ended up as the nominal peacekeepers, if you will. There were never peace agreements signed. There were just ceasefires. And the Russians manned the ceasefire, or the election monitors, the ceasefire monitors in both places. There were Georgians also involved in South Ossetia. But one also has to keep in mind that the roots of what happened in South Ossetia just over the last couple of weeks go back to this period. Because for the Georgians, there is a very strong enmity towards Russia, because they basically believe, with some justification, that these two secessionist struggles would not have succeeded without Russian help for the secessionist military, and also for help in sustaining the separatist governments once the Georgians were driven out. So you have, on the one hand, the Georgians obviously very upset because part of their territory is not under their control. The Russians are both the primary peace negotiators or peace mediators, and at the same time, they're supporting one side in the separatist struggle. So you can see from the Georgian side, some of the reasons why, for them, this was a very, very, very unsatisfactory state of affairs. Since 1993-94, when these ceasefires took hold, there have been periodic outbreaks of hostilities. And the ironic thing is that everyone thought, including me, that the situation in Abkhazia was more threatening. The fighting there had been more serious. And I think if people were going to bet, they would have bet that if there were going to be a resumption of full-scale hostilities, it would be over Abkhazia. South Ossetia, the initial fighting in the 90s, there were thousands of casualties, but it was somewhat less than Abkhazia. And most people felt that at some point, the South Ossetian situation, could be resolved. Another few key points, in the year 2003, Edward Shevardnadze was basically ousted as the president of Georgia. He had not succeeded in resolving these questions. And his successor, Mikhail Saakashvili, a young member of parliament and minister that I knew rather well, became the president after successfully outing Shevardnadze. And one of his major platforms in being elected was that he was going to regather, he was going to bring back these Georgian territories that were no longer under Georgian control. And he did succeed in a region called Ajara, which is down in the Black Sea. That was not a formally separatist area, but they tended to go their own ways. He managed to get Ajara back, and he also managed in Abkhazia to reintroduce Georgian, basically military and police into an area called the Upper Kadori Gorge. So part of Abkhazia was still controlled, by Georgia, and you should also keep in mind that part of South Ossetia was also still controlled by Georgians, sort of the lower part of it. The capital and the northern region were all controlled by separatists, but there were still Georgian villages, in South Ossetia. And the Georgians under Saakashvili set up basically a rival government to the South Ossetian government, the secessionist government, and they were trying to promote, that government as an alternative, a magnet, to bring South Ossetia back. I'll just finish now, just coming fast forward to sort of what precipitated, this latest, outbreak of events. And I would mention a couple of things. One is the declaration of independence by Kosovo and the recognition of Kosovo, by many Western countries, but not the Russians. Russians were very angry about it and started making noise, almost immediately threatening that they would assist South Ossetia and Abkhazia to become independent. If Kosovo could break off, from a mother state and become independent, why could not South Ossetia and Abkhazia? The West, of course, the United States, argued that the issues were completely separate, that the cases were not identical, and that Kosovo was no precedent. But nonetheless, it bothered the Russians very, very much. A second factor that I would strongly emphasize is that the relationships between Russia and Georgia they were pained and difficult for a variety of reasons beyond even these secessionist areas. Georgian foreign policy is very much oriented towards the West. Georgia, for a long time, was promoting and has successfully assisted in the development of east-west pipelines of oil and gas that skirted Russia. That bothered the Russians terribly. The fact that the Georgians, want to join NATO, that was also something that was very, very worrisome to the Russians. And finally, the personal relationships are almost poisonous between the Russian and the Georgian leadership. I've sat in on some phone calls, presidential phone calls, and listened to what goes on. This was, when I was still ambassador. And the venom is palpable. The Russians are still furious with the Georgians because they would not let the Russians use their bases in Georgia, which they then had, to attack into Chechnya in the early 2000s, around the time of the Second Chechen War. And they simply look at the Georgians as ungrateful, traitorous people. Shevardnadze, the president, was the one who helped negotiate the end of the Soviet Union and the withdrawal of the Soviet armed forces, from Germany. And the Russians simply have not forgotten that. So there's a very strong visceral personal element as well as political, and military. And for the Georgians, as I said, this very intense dislike of the Russians because of what they've done in the separatist areas, and also they've had very strong disagreements over supplies of Russian oil and gas, with which the Russians have cut off. So there are really some very, very strong and deep-seated antipathies there. But as I said, the thing that really set things off was Kosovo, and then in April, when the NATO summit meeting in Bucharest decided that Ukraine and Georgia, were to become eventually members of NATO. That seems to have been, for the Russians, a red line. The Russians then started to heat up things in Abkhazia. That was calmed down, and then the surprise came, 2 weeks later or 2 weeks ago in South Ossetia when, as nearly as I can tell, and I'll finish here, Georgians were basically shot at by South Ossetians, and the Georgians fired back, and then they increased their firing and killed apparently some of the Russian quote-unquote peacekeepers. The Georgians then observed a ceasefire. They argue that the Russians kept coming in. They had no choice, so they went in with pretty much of a full-scale intervention in Skin Valley, the capital. The Russians were quiescent for about a day and then reacted, ferociously. And not surprisingly, because, as I said, this is, I think, something that's been brewing, for some time. And the results, I think, are, as you know, they not only forced the Georgians completely out of South Ossetia, they did so out of Abkhazia, and are now occupying much of Georgia and have split the country in half. The Georgians, of course, are appealing for help, and the NATO ministers met yesterday. There won't be any military assistance, direct military assistance coming in, but there will be more political diplomatic help. So I'd like to leave it there and then turn it over to Bill Wohlforth.
Well, Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you for organizing this panel. Certainly it is intimidating for me to follow somebody who has direct personal, professional experience in this region, a person who can talk on the phone to the president of Georgia. Of course, perhaps that's not as impressive these days because Mikhail Saakashvili seems to be on the television more than almost anybody else. Some people think that he's the host and the Americans are the guests. What I want to do very briefly is just give you a sense of what I think most scholars of Russian foreign policy regard as the Russian background on this, and we can leave for the Q&A some of the more immediate questions. I think the big question people probably are asking themselves is, why did Russia do this? Why did Russia use military force in a very big way in its southern neighbor? And I think the answer to that question can be answered both in terms of looking back toward the medium term, looking back, say, 10 or 15 years, and also, obviously, the much more immediate antecedents to the conflict that Ambassador Yalowitz mentioned. I'm not going to talk about what we might call the long term, because the long term, looking back in history, would require, obviously, a journey back into the Russian Empire, the Soviet days, the days of Stalin as the Commissar of Nationalities, and so on and so forth, for which we do not have time today. But the action that Russia has taken is completely consistent with long-standing Russian policy. It is consistent with a clearly articulated policy, at least 15 years old, of seeking to be the primary manager of security affairs in its region defined as the area of the former Soviet Union. Part of its policy of wanting to be the supreme or primary manager of security in the former Soviet space is the opposition of Russia, long-standing, to the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to its neighbors. Russia has made two formal attempts to join NATO. These occurred under President Yeltsin. Its policy was, if you let us in to your alliance, then it will not be considered alliance opposed to us, and we will, of course, support its expansion. If you do not let us in, that is proof that it is directed against us, and therefore we oppose its expansion. Both of those attempts to join obviously failed, and ever since, Russia has been opposed to the expansion of NATO. All three post-Soviet Russian presidents, Yeltsin, Putin, and Medvedev, have expressed this opposition. All of Russia's foreign ministers have expressed this opposition. Every single defense minister has expressed this opposition. In fact, every top Russian official has, for 15 years, stated clearly direct, serious national security opposition to the expansion of NATO into its neighboring countries. In pushing NATO expansion towards Georgia and Ukraine, the United States and its allies, of course, are knowingly adopting a policy that is directed against a core national security interest of Russia. This is all obviously known, this is all clear, but nonetheless this is an important background to the policy. When asked why they would like to be the regional hegemon of security, Russians will answer for the same reasons the United States wants to be the regional hegemon of security in its region. They would go further and, state that we prefer that our neighbors not be members of hostile alliances for the same reason the United States would prefer that Canada and Mexico not be members of hostile alliances. And they go on, of course, to ask why is it that the United States is interested in dominating the security affairs of our region. Russia, they will tell you, does not face a choice of handing security affairs of its neighbors to some impartial international organization. It is not as if, in the absence of Russia, the UN will manage the security affairs of its region. The choice which Russians are presented with, they think, is between we dominate it or NATO dominates it. In other words, we dominate it or an organization that is hostile to us dominates it. That is the background of Russian policy. Also consistent, the recent move in Georgia is also consistent with the Russians' long-standing policy of seeking maximum control over the transport of energy resources from the post-Soviet region. This, again, is a long-standing policy. So, obviously, when the United States led the creation, spearheaded the expensive and protracted struggle to route pipelines across Georgia to avoid Russian control, they were doing something that they knew very well to be against this stated Russian interest. When asked why it is that they seek energy hegemony in their regions, Russians say for the same reason the United States does. Again, they say, we don't face a choice between our control over the energy resources and some impartial market forces, we face a choice between our control and the control of other countries and their leading multinational corporations. To advance this general policy of opposition to NATO expansion and Russian hegemony in their region, Russia supported South Ossetia and Abkhazia, both military and economically, for many, many years. And it did so cynically, of course, perfectly willing to sell out the Ossetians and the Abkhaz in return for a subservient Georgia. All Georgia had to do to solve these Abkhaz and Osset problems as far as Russia was concerned was stop trying to be independent of Russia and accept Russian hegemony. Now, the degree of support of Russia for their allies in these two regions correlates fairly well, to Georgia's own policy towards Russia and the West. So it's not surprising that as Georgia moves more to the West in recent years under Saakashvili, that Russia has increased its stakes in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as well as adopting many other strong anti-Georgian measures, including boycotts against various goods by Georgia, exports to Russia, and so on and so forth. And so predictably, as Russia's support for these two enclaves increased, it became harder and harder for Russia easily to back down if challenged. This, again, is very typical in international politics. The more Russia raised the stakes, the harder it becomes to back down. And the strongest move, of course, was conferring Russian citizenship on the citizens of these enclaves who so desired. The result of conveying Russian citizenship, of course, is to dramatically raise the stakes in a high-stakes poker game with Georgia and the West. And when Russia took this measure, it knew damn well that once it offered that citizenship, it could not easily sell out the people who it had been backing in these regions. It did that purposely and knowingly to raise the stakes in the conflict. And so, in a pure strategy situation, once Georgia had moved to reassert its control over its nominally sovereign territories, Russia was put in a situation. Russia was put in a conundrum. Either it had to take some measure to thwart this, or it had to face a situation of the Georgians would succeed in creating facts on the ground which would make it harder for Russia to reassert itself in the future. This became particularly the case once Georgia had opted to use force in response to the events that Ambassador Yalowitz described in South Ossetia. If the Georgians had succeeded in taking over the capital of South Ossetia, the situation for Russia would have been very much worse. Because if they had succeeded, they would have created a fact on the ground much more expensive and difficult for Russia to reverse, either diplomatically or militarily. Russia, of course, had long been preparing this military action. Russia had positioned military forces for it. Russian military had undergone exercises in preparation for it, all of which meant Russia was ready to move very swiftly. And it had to move swiftly. The more swiftly it moved, the more quickly it could close the window of opportunity that Mikhail Saakashvili sought to jump through. And so you saw the attack. Why did Russia move beyond the actual enclave of North Ossetia, moving into Georgia proper? Well, the answer there are several. Of course, we don't know the specific motivations, so we can't read between the ears of Russian leaders and Russian generals. But this action is very consistent with longstanding Russian military doctrine and operational procedure. When I say to you Russian military, I don't think you start thinking precision operation. When I say Russian military, the word pinprick doesn't come to mind. No, when I say Russian military, you think big operation. These guys are going to control the environment in which they're operating in, which means they're going to make sure that there's no opportunity for any resurgence of Georgian capability in these regions. They furthermore are going to range wide and destroy the military capability that Georgia, they believe, had been building up under the auspices of the United States in recent years, which is precisely what they're doing. So what I did do is just sort of leave you with that background and then step back and make a comment. Thus far, I think I've been describing to you things as honestly and sincerely as I can from a Russian perspective. This is not my view, nor is it necessarily what I would do if I were running Russian foreign policy. It is, however, I believe, a faithful rendition of how the Russian top leadership and elites view this crisis. Now let me step back and make a comment. And the comment is simply that, from my perspective, the coverage of this event in the West has been shall we say, slightly biased. Very few of the reporters who report on this have managed to convey to their readers any sense of how Russian foreign policy elites might view this. As a scholar of international relations as well as foreign policy, Russian foreign policy, what I can say is there is nothing particularly Russian about this event. There's nothing peculiarly Russian about what they've done. You don't need to get inside the Russian soul or the Russian psyche or the Russian domestic politics or even Putin to understand why a great power might want to control its surroundings. This is how great powers behave. In general, they want to influence the security affairs of their regions, and they use the tools at their disposal to do so. So the reporting in the West seems strange to me. If I recall rightly, if I'm not mistaken, the United States did the following things in recent years. It mined the harbors of Nicaragua because Nicaragua wanted to import weapons from the Soviet Union. It attacked and overthrew the government of Grenada because, if I remember correctly, some medical students were being held hostage. I think I get this right, it overthrew and attacked and occupied with 40,000 troops the country of Panama. The event precipitating that, if I recall correctly, was a soldier's wife who was assaulted. I could go on with these sorts of examples. The key point is you don't need specific Russian explanations for this kind of behavior. That, of course, leaves many questions unanswered, which I look forward to discussing in the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Yalowitz, for having me here. I'm probably not only the least informed about Georgia in particular and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but perhaps the least informed about everything relative to the other panelists. But what I hope to do is give you a sense of the South Ossetian conflict in particular, but also the Abkhaz conflict in relation to secession writ large. What you probably haven't been reading about in the newspapers is that secession is a very common source of conflict in modern day politics worldwide. It tends not to affect South America, but anywhere else in the world you can find a secessionist conflict that's very similar to these that we see today. These two conflicts are actually two conflicts among many in the Caucasus. There's South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, but in Azerbaijan, you can just see it here at the very bottom. You've got Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an Armenian enclave that's completely surrounded by Azerbaijan. The Chechen conflict is still ongoing, though at a much lower level than it had been throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And then also in Moldova, you have the Transnistria or Transnistria conflict. So within this region alone, there are a number of conflicts. But worldwide, there are much larger, much more explosive conflicts that are associated with secession. The conflict for Tamil Nadu Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka has killed hundreds now of thousands of people in the last 30 to 40 years. So secession is a large cause of conflict worldwide, and these are very small conflicts. In the first conflict in South Ossetia, scholars of international relations, though it was a violent conflict, scholars of international relations wouldn't even call it a war because there was such a minimal number of casualties. In the Abkhaz case, it was a war, but it was a very low-level casualty war. Really, it was Chechnya that was the big secessionist conflict. In the first Chechen War, it's estimated that there were about 90,000 deaths, and 2/3 of those deaths were Russian troops that had died. So secession and this type of conflict is really important for Russian foreign policy in general, right? Because Georgia was seen as aiding Chechen separatists, particularly allowing them to cross the border and seek refuge in its territory while Russia was fighting its own separatists. When it comes to the Ossetians, South Ossetian national identity, or Osset national identity, is not particularly well formed. When it comes to the Ossets within Georgia, I think it's about 12% of Ossetians live within Georgia. So there's a large national group that's mostly outside of Georgian borders. And within Georgia, the South Ossetians only make up about 3% of the population. So it's an exceedingly small number that are establishing this homeland for South Ossetia. And people are of two different minds about whether or not the Ossets actually want independence or want association with Russia. Ostensibly, the South Ossets have demanded independence. They've created their own national governments. They've held elections for their presidency, which no one recognizes, including the Georgian government. But they have a shadow regime that controls things within the territory, right? At the same time, Russia seems less convinced that what's going to happen would be independence in the best case scenario. So while the Ossets say that they demand independence, more and more it's looking as though it would be a case of Russian annexation of South Ossetia. And Georgia has gone to extreme lengths to attempt to accommodate the Ossets short of independence. In fact, they've offered almost everything short of independence, and that's been rejected. So it's a difficult kind of catch-22 situation for the Ossets. Any attempt that they would make at this point to become independent might not actually result in independence, because they would need to seek Russian support and effectively become dependent upon the Russians in order to maintain that independence. When it comes to secession in general, the most recent conflict has its roots in or is immediately predated by the Kosovo conflict over Kosovo, and the Russian government says that Kosovo is perfectly analogous to what we have in South Ossetia. It's not. There are important differences, but the West overstates the differences. Actually, the State Department has a list that you can look at about why Kosovo is different from anything and everything else. It's an interesting read. There are some important differences. Superficially, they seem similar because Kosovo was a secessionist movement, demanded independence, started out peaceably, then became violent, had a terrorist organization, the KLA, and had a modicum of independence during the conflict, but then during the Yugoslav conflict, but then was overtaken and experienced ethnic cleansing. South Ossetia didn't really experience ethnic cleansing. Russia claims that it did. There was a period of Georgianization, which was very difficult for Ossets and minority groups within Georgia writ large. It made them feel very threatened by Georgian national identity. And there were corruption problems. There still are corruption problems. And there's been quite a bit of political violence as of late when it comes to the opposition. In 2007, Saakashvili cracked down, called a state of emergency to stop opposition within Georgia. But the Ossets didn't really experience ethnic cleansing. But in other ways, they're very similar to the Kosovars. They probably couldn't be independent by themselves. In Kosovo, the United States and Western countries, of which there are about 42 now that have signed on, those 42 countries believe that there's no alternative to independence for Kosovo. That Kosovo, even though Serbia has offered, it has gone to extreme lengths, similar to Georgia, to attempt to create a workable solution, nominal dependence, but effective independence within Serbia. The West has decided that can't be the course that Kosovo takes. Yet, by the same token, they're attempting to create something like that for Georgia and keep South Ossetia and keep Abkhazia within Georgia, although they've been de facto independent, South Ossetia actually longer than Abkhazia. So there are some parallels there, and they're not just playing politics. It's a fundamental difference of opinion about what circumstances under which should the international community say this national minority, this national group has suffered enough and deserves an independent state, or we are willing to put our strength behind this minority group and allow them to be independent. None of them have particularly good prospects of survival without a quorum of the international community deciding that they ought to be independent.
Yeah, Maria.
Hi, I really liked very much your presentation and how it laid out a lot of issues for us. So I have comments and questions. So the first one is about the link between Kosovo and the Georgian territory. So do you think that the question of de facto politics that has been going on in one case and the other will be linked in the international sphere in such a way so that, for example, the northern parts of Kosovo, which are completely Serbian-oriented, Mitrovica, that they will be divided at a later point of time, depending on what is going on now in Georgia. So do you think these two conflicts link in the big power politics and how bigger countries like the United States and Russia are settling their scores? And this brings me to the second question, which is also how, this was very good reading of Professor Wohlforth, that it's impossible for Russia to think in different terms than power politics. But in this situation, and to see also how Americans will deal in this way. But the question here is how long would we have expected Russia to be with twisted hands in the UN Security Council and a lot of decisions being bypassed so that it doesn't find an outlet in steering ethnic issues like the one here. And to further this question down, I have been seeing from recent trips to the Balkans that Russian influence, for example, in Bulgaria, my home country, has been getting more and more influence because of this way in which it doesn't want to stop its power that was earlier there and so on. And the third one is related to a dimension that you didn't kind of mention, and it's about the expansion not simply in energy politics and security politics, but also in terms of regime. So Russia, over the past years with Putin in place, unlike the Yeltsin era, has been much more expanding on a new sort of exporting of authoritarianism, or sorts of Russian democracy on our terms. So which has been spreading, and Georgia was a perfect case with the Rose Revolution, that it was getting more of the influence in terms of values of the Western world. And do you see this in terms of Russian politics being also a way in which it would have more problems in other parts of Eastern Europe, let's say, which would be part of the European Union nowadays?
Thank you very much, Amelia. I think what I'm going to do is ask Bridget to do the first one, Bill the second, and I'll do the third, because I think you've covered a lot of territory.
With respect to Kosovo, the West has avowedly said that the Serbian areas of Kosovo will not be Serbia's, that they won't allow any further disintegration. Effectively, that causes a problem for the new Europeans that come to take over, and that being that they've been effectively independent for quite some time. And they'll need to figure out a way to somehow incorporate Serbs into the new independent Kosovo, should that be the end result of what's going on right now. Does the Kosovo conflict will the Kosovo conflict and its outcomes influence the post-Soviet conflict? I think that Russia will want to draw attention to Kosovo and the way that the rest of the international community has been handling Kosovo. I don't think that it will act as a precedent, and people have been very careful. Lawyers, in particular, have been very careful to make sure that it is not a legal precedent for anything to come. But these conflicts are also at the dividing line between domestic and international politics, and legally, it's Georgia's decision how to deal with these areas. Now, functionally, it's also now a Russian question and a question of international politics. But there's no necessary reason why they would be linked according to law or politics.
Yes, I stressed in my remarks continuity, and I think there is substantial continuity between the Russian foreign policy of Yeltsin and Russian foreign policy of Putin, far more continuity than is commonly recognized in commentaries. The difference, many of the differences that you see are the result not of interest, but of capability. Russia now has more capability than it did in the 1990s. A Yeltsin that had been more capable would have been much more vigorous in opposing certain developments in his region. That said, there's no question about it. The domestic scene in Russia has been transformed in the direction of what the Russians call sovereign democracy, and what most other people see as a kind of quasi-authoritarian regime with some democratic trappings. And for the two motives which are extremely important in human behavior, fear and greed, for those two motives, Russians have seen an interest in seeking to influence the domestic politics of neighbors away from the so-called color revolutions. They, as you know, invested a great deal to thwart that outcome in Ukraine, seeking massive intervention in the election in Ukraine. They have done the policies that I've discussed in Georgia. They have worked in Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere as a consistent policy of seeking friendly regimes. And they view the color revolution potential outcomes as the potential outcomes of color revolutions as potentially resulting in non-friendly or unfriendly regimes. And therefore this is consistent with the longstanding policy that I discussed, but has the new element of this this quasi-authoritarian preference that they have.
Yeah, I fully agree with what you just said, Bill. When I look at the former Soviet Union and also Eastern Europe, when you factor in, China, Russia, what you're seeing is, at the end of the Cold War, our good friend Francis Fukuyama, saying we're at the end of history, and that democracy and capitalism, were basically going to prevail. That's a very simplified version of his viewpoint. But I think we're beginning to see that that's not exactly the case at all. And the sovereign democracy that Bill mentioned is a model that I personally find very worrisome in that part of the world, because you've got the Russians, the Chinese, and others pushing it. It's very prevalent in Central Asia. My old friend, the president of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko, is another proponent of this. And in your area of the world, even in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, when you look at public opinion polling and you look at support for NATO and even the EU, it's not as strong as it was in the years right after independence and overthrowing the communist regimes. So one of the arguments that I try to make is that, unfortunately, with our focus on the Middle East, on Iraq and Afghanistan, as important as they are, we've not paid attention to these trends, which I think are very worrisome. And likewise, when I was in Georgia earlier, and all of my predecessors and successors all pointed out, that these two issues, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and also Transnistria were unresolved. And, I would not, it might be too strong to say that there were powder kegs waiting to blow up, but the longer they were ignored, the longer, that nobody paid attention to them, the greater the chance was that something could blow up. And what I'm hoping very much is that the next administration, is going to start paying attention to some of these issues, because these trends, to me, are not very positive. Chris?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, I wonder if there's a sense here in all of this, you haven't quite touched on, which is the feeling of humiliation by Russians since the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union. The humiliation of the Russian army in two wars with Chechnya, where they were basically unable to perform as they were supposed to. They finally have somebody to beat up who's smaller and they can get away with it. I wonder if there's some, to what extent this is enthusiasm. The whole notion of the Putin government giving Russians back their sense of importance in that area. I think there's a psychological thing happening here with the Russian character that is
I'm
not.
going to ask Bill to
Well,
answer.
everything you say is true, but none of it is necessary to explain this action. It is true in the sense that the Russian elite and much of the population that paid attention to such matters did feel this sense of humiliation, and for good reason. On issue after issue, they staked out a position clearly and adamantly, and on issue after issue, they lost. So after a while, this does affect the perceptions of an elite. Nevertheless, you have no need for this to explain this behavior. I ask you, if the United States had had 15 soldiers that it regarded as peacekeepers killed in a province of Mexico bordering on our country, I don't think you would have to refer to any peculiar U.S. You don't have to go to Manifest Destiny or any particular peculiar U.S. penchant for imperialism to explain why the United States would probably take very vigorous action in response. So again, I see those things as true, but utterly unnecessary to explain this behavior. Russia, had it been feeling its oats and feeling less humiliated, it would have likely done a very similar thing.
I would disagree on the degree here. Again, perhaps because having lived in both places, in Russia and Georgia, in Russia at the time of the breakup, the sense of humiliation, was enormous. And, by the same token, living in Georgia those 3 years that we were there, there was, Georgia was an independent country. South Ossetia, and Abkhazia were formally recognized by Russia as part of Georgia, and yet they were doing everything possible, to detach them, at least, de facto. And it was, a very, very difficult, thing to watch. But the thing that there are two issues here that I wanted to focus on. One is the degree of what the Russians did in Georgia. If we had gone into Mexico, I can see, pacifying a certain area. But they basically have destroyed the economic infrastructure of Georgia. They've cut the country in half. They've bollocksed up there. They're blockading their ports. I mean, they are, this is punitive. I think it's definitely designed to give a lesson. It's a warning. And I think it's also very much a calling card to say, we are back. We have been humiliated. You were throwing NATO down our necks at us, and we're going to show you that we're not going to take it sitting down. The greater question to me in certain ways, and my having been in Georgia, and I admit I like Georgia very, very much, is why the Georgians fell for this. Because in my view, I think the Georgians were provoked. I think what happened in Skimvali, it looks like it was the South Ossets who did the shelling. The Russians probably weren't involved. But I think one could argue that in certain ways this was a provocation. The Georgians went for it completely. They shot their wad militarily, and they're getting punished extremely for it. And I hope that the Georgians, will examine this very, very carefully, their decision making, their intelligence, why they did this, because for all the reasons that you've articulated, I think one could have predicted that this is how the Russians, would have reacted. And that's the question that I have, is why? Yep.
Do you think another alternative was the reestablishment of the Red Army as an instrument of foreign policy for the backing Russian foreign policy? And is it a signal to Ukraine as to if they continue on the path to being courted by NATO? Is it a very blunt message to them as to what could follow now that the image of the Red Army has been, shall we say, embossed, and yesterday's security pact, or whatever we want to call it, with Poland, is that a way of the Poles reestablishing where their loyalties are?
I believe that there are many Russians of the top echelons who hope that that message will indeed have that effect, or that their action will indeed have that convey that message, just as there were people at the top of U.S. decision-making circles who hoped that the invasion of Iraq would send a similar message to Iran. And those kinds of messages, of course, don't always work, as we've discovered. It's unlikely, however, that the Georgians will do what forces in Iraq did, that is to say, to mount an insurgency, which, of course, is far greater challenge to a military than a conventional military. So that said, I think there are many who hope that that is a message that will get out. I don't think it necessarily is necessary to explain the action. I think if the sole result is to change the equation on the ground in Georgia, that people in Moscow will regard it as having been a success. As far as the effectiveness of the Russian military, it's still, the expert military opinion is that there has been a marginal improvement. This was a combined arm operation. This involved naval forces, air forces, ground forces. It involved coordinating different units. It's not easy to do these kinds of things. Imagine you've got a family of 7, and you're going to have to get up and quickly go on a picnic, and then meet another family of 7 halfway there, and then a third family of 7 is going to all converge at the same point. You can get a sense of how difficult these military logistics are. Observers credit the Russian military with pulling off that aspect of it. However, as Ambassador Yalowitz mentioned, you're not moving against a particularly powerful opponent, and even within there were some problems observed among the Russian military, and so I think professional military observers are not going to dramatically change their view of the effectiveness of the Russian military based on this particular operation.
I also, and Bill, I'd love to just get your opinion on this too. There's a sort of a cyclical thing that we noticed. We went into Vietnam, the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, in many ways repeated, the same types of mistakes. We went into Iraq, for regime change and to, change the balance of power, in that part of the world. And the Russians clearly wanted regime change, in Georgia, either directly or indirectly. My question is, and you see what we've gained from it, with Iraq. My question is whether or not, the reactions, and the gentleman mentioned Poland, whether or not this is going to redound to the Russians in a negative way, in terms of, instead of intimidating the neighbors, instead of, forcing them to, really pay obeisance to Moscow, that there might be another reaction that sets in that over time costs them more than they think it's going to happen.
It's quite possible. They're making, obviously, the bet that that won't be the case. As they look towards the West, they see division within the West over the sagacity of expanding NATO to these countries, the degree to which the alliance is strengthened by bringing in countries that have these kinds of divisions within them. And obviously, you can't forecast what's going to happen, but there's obviously a great debate now emerging in the West over what to do, with classically 2 camps. One camp is called engagement, or to use the old phrase, appeasement, which says Russia is a necessary partner, Georgia a nice country, but if I'm forced to choose between Georgia and Russia, even though I don't really like Russia, because it's so important, I'll go with Russia, and therefore we will appease or we will engage Russia. versus the containment camp, which includes, of course, all of our neoconservatives in this country. You can almost sense a degree of eagerness on their part that now we've got a good great power rival on our hands again. That is to contain Russia. Let's expand NATO. Let's reinvigorate the policy and show Russia, teach Russia a lesson that this kind of behavior won't work. I can't forecast which of these two camps will win, but if I had to put my money down, I doubt the containers will win. Not least because of the 40% of European gas that comes from Russia, and a series of other reasons that make Russia a little bit harder to contain. I also think that Russia will probably moderate its policy to a certain degree, recognizing a great degree of dependency that it has, not least, of course, the fortunes of Putin and the other oligarchs that are sitting in Western financial institutions as we speak. These create a certain degree of limits, I think, on their part.
There's a camp somewhere in the middle, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Oh, no, I just
Heidi,
want
please.
to make a comment. I agree with Wohlforth and what he has said. Russia is just behaving like a great power. I also would, when they were moving into Georgia proper, I was also thinking, Serbia, what did we do to Serbia? We bombed them. And Kosovo, Serbia, I think there's a connection here of how the Russians are behaving there, just to show us that, look, you did that to Serbia, we are doing this to Georgia. But beyond that, I think the map, Georgia is only of interest to the United States because of oil. And what is going on there, and the map doesn't show it. I mean, we should have included Iran. And then there's the whole issue even extending further beyond Georgia, pipelines, gas, the Russians are establishing their interests again in Central Asia, Tajikistan. They want the gas. They want the gas to go through their pipelines, not through a Georgian pipeline. So what is going on there is also a strategic struggle over oil, gas, and of course that also has made the Western Europeans very dependent, as you have already noticed. So it goes beyond Georgia even. But I don't see Georgia or Saakashvili, the trigger belligerent president of Georgia, as the innocent person here either. I mean, he had himself elected on the platform of reunification of Georgia. And he moved in on, Azaria, he did. And he's not a Democrat. He has, repressed his opposition. There are murders and unexplained strange things going on there in the leadership also. And there is a kind of hatred that especially Putin has for the Georgian leadership that has also influenced this conflict.
Are you arguing that Putin is more democratic?
No, I'm not arguing that, but I'd say Saakashvili is
Democrat.
not a wonderful Democrat. I mean, we love him, this West, American educated, Columbia, whatever, his law degree. He is not, he, I think, in some ways has been a disaster for Georgia.
I can tell you, I don't want to get into a long discussion on this, but I agree with you on his flaws, but Georgia's far more open and democratic than it ever was under Shevardnadze, and it's far better than Russia today. Let's see. Sir.
Yeah, I have no influence on or thoughts about Russia or the other ones, but I do have a perspective on Georgia. I've spent about 10 years there. I was over there when the Russians came in and with tanks into Tbilisi and killed the Georgians. I was there. I was kidnapped in Georgia and held under by a shotgun. I've been on the telephone with my Georgian friends for the last every day, and since this has happened. And the perspective of the Georgians is not what I've been hearing here. I don't hear the Georgian perspective being articulated. They have a different view on Abkhazia and South Ossetia that goes back at least 100 years from listening to them. In Abkhazia, they would claim that 17% of the population was Abkhazian and 82% was Georgian, and the 17% took over the country. There are, as Ken probably knows, there are all those refugees from Georgia that walked over the mountains in the dead of winter to escape Abkhazia, and that the regime that's in there in Abkhazia now is puppet regime of the Georgians, and that it's been annexed, as you said, that with Russian passports. They were and have been annexed by the Russians, and the same with Ossetia, that the South Ossetian isn't a normal community, that it was placed there by Stalin. They took people from North Ossetia, Ossetians, and put them in South Ossetia across the Caucasus Mountains, just so that they would have an autonomous enclave that could rebel against the regime if anything ever went against the Russians. They would also argue that Ajaria, but Aslan Abershitz, as I recall, was the name of the guy. He was a crook, okay, and he was very, very corrupt. So when they took back Ajaria, they weren't taking back a minority, a secessionist regime. They were trying to kick out a guy that was corrupt and is now living in Moscow. And they would also argue that the same thing is happening in Abkhazia and Ossetia, that the people that are in charge there are not the people that are legitimate governments. The secessionist movements and the normal population doesn't care about these guys. What they care about is that these guys are in there and putting money in their pocket, and that the pipelines that are going through are really very key. And when you talk about these people that are, whether it's going to be the neoconservatives or the accommodation to the Russians, there's two ways to get gas and oil out of that Central Asian region. One way is by the Silk Road, which goes through Georgia and has gone for 1,000 years through Georgia, because that valley there, what the map doesn't show, there's a mountain range on the south.
Sir, could I just ask you to finish up, because I don't know that others ask questions.
Because what I want to know is what's going to happen in the future. We now have the Russians in the center of the country, cutting it in two, jeopardizing all that energy. How do you see it playing in the future? Where is the resolution going to come from? What are the Russians going? Are they going to come out? Are the Americans going to support them? Where's the future?
That's clearly for you.
Is it? I mean, you're absolutely right about the groups being minority populations, and the Georgian government definitely regard the secessionist territories as fifth columns, right? And I think rightfully so. And there is a nefarious relationship between Russia and the Ossets and Russia and the Abkhaz, and it's become even more so, or it became even more so as Georgia became more assertive at attempting to take the territories back. So the special passport rules, or the special access that these territories, people from these territories are given, that Georgians are not given, it's definitely exacerbated the situation. And the problem of refugees is a large one, and something that's been going on for a very long time and has only become more acute now that kind of more large-scale violence has resumed. I would say that in all of these frozen conflicts, now two active conflicts, but in all of these cases, it's better to have control by someone than no one. Because what we've had for the past 15 years has been essentially kind of what Ajara was, but this festering, illegal transit point for drugs and weapons and human trafficking, and bad places that no one takes responsibility for, because Georgia doesn't effectively have control, and Russia or the Ossets and the Abkhaz are not empowered to negotiate with anyone because they lack the legitimacy. I think that the United States will be hesitant to become involved. I think that Europe will also be very hesitant to be involved. They're more dependent than the United States is, certainly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where it's going.
Yeah, and well, let's go ahead.
But wait a minute, his last question was really key, and you're a diplomat.
No, well, the answer, what I was going to say, the answer to me, and this is why I say there was an answer somewhere up the middle between the two camps that you were talking about. To me, I think a lot of the effort is going to have to go into encouraging countries in the region. I'm talking about Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and perhaps the Central Asians, who all have an interest now in these pipelines, going east-west, to have a better capability to defend themselves and to encourage them to cooperate with one another. This is why I asked the question whether or not, the invasion may end up being a short-term, tactical victory and a long-term strategic defeat for the Russians. I may be wrong, but I'm saying as I look at an answer for this, is that's the way that that you try to deal with this, is to prevent. On the one hand, you've got to keep the doors open, to the Russians, the realist school, and you just can't ignore them. On the other hand, if you take the side of the containment side, if you will, on this one, you do it by improving the capacity of these countries to defend themselves better.
Militarily, you mean?
Yeah,
Very
defensively. Defensive militarily. There's
Very
a big
quick,
difference.
just very quickly on the
Missile system? That's also.
That's not what I'm talking about. Yeah.
No, but it's a real issue, isn't it?
Yeah,
if you say
it
you
is.
have to improve their capacity to defend
Yeah.
themselves, then to some countries that increased capacity to defend looks a little bit like it's
No,
a
but
defense.
the missiles in Poland are, as I said, they're really not for Polish defense. They're more, they're more for us. What I'm talking about is giving countries, like Azerbaijan, the ability. I'm talking about air defense systems, a more localized type of thing. So that's what I'm talking about. Phil, go ahead.
I was only going to say, getting back to the gentleman's original question, what happens? There's a great deal of uncertainty about this, and I think any of us would be really imprudent to try to predict. But right now, it looks very like the following facts are going to be with us for a while. First, it seems to me highly unlikely, not to close. Well, anything could happen in international politics, but highly unlikely that these two enclaves will be incorporated back into the Georgian polity. It seems highly unlikely that Russia will actually occupy Georgia over the long term, partition it, and conduct regime change. There are several reasons that could go into why I don't think that's going to happen. The most likely outcome, it seems to me, in the near medium term is a phased Russian withdrawal back, leaving a rather robust presence, but much less than you see now, outside of the enclaves, and possibly ceasefire monitoring by Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe type people, European, but these would not be peacekeepers, these would be monitors. So what you would be going back to is essentially the status quo ante of a frozen conflict, however, with the Georgian and, until something else happens, Western position dramatically weakened and the Russian position dramatically strengthened. Any negotiations to proceed from there. The final thing to point out, as I know Professor Coggins knows a lot better than I the history on this, but Russia has been very wary, actually, of recognizing the independence of these states, and even wary of annexation because of the possible precedent this sets in other areas. And bear in mind also, Russia's big ally in international relations is China. China and Russia, one of the fulcrums of their cooperation is opposition to this kind of secessionism. Therefore, Russia is in a very dicey diplomatic position if it's going to change its long-standing policy, which has been to prefer ambiguity and frozenness to a decisive secession by these entities. And it'll be a very important thing to watch in those of us who are watching Russian foreign policy to see where they end up on this. And that will very much determine the nature of the settlement.
It's Chechnya in particular.
Yeah.
Felix?
Yeah. Thanks. Very interesting presentations. I have a question also regarding the what next sphere concerning the debate within NATO that I think Professor Wohlforth briefly mentioned. I was wondering if you could sketch out a bit how important Georgia is for NATO, given that NATO doesn't admit anyone who just wants to become a member? As you mentioned, Russia was not admitted. So how likely is it that Georgia is really on the track to become a NATO member? Meaning that how risky is it now for NATO to actually extend the, seriously make the offer for membership and put Georgia on the track? And the second point, maybe related to that, is, isn't it a bit too easy to say that the debate within NATO is between containment and appeasement? Because that really sounds to me like falling back into the Cold War kind of categorization of how to deal with Russia. Whereas, to me at least, the debate within NATO doesn't seem to be going along these kind of two terms. In particular, if you talk about containment as something that is, it's a fluffy term in itself, as keeping Russia in check. Isn't there really a sense of, that might not be worth it? We really, like from the American perspective, that we really have problems elsewhere right now.
Well, it probably is something of a simplification, but part of my job here is to clarify things. And I do think that at the end of the day, you do have two fairly distinct positions regarding Russia. The one end of the spectrum represented right now by the United States and Britain and the Central European members of the alliance, and the other end generally assumed to represent the position where France and Germany are, namely a greater reluctance on the part of those two countries and a greater reluctance on the part of those two countries to commit unambiguously to a membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine, and a moderation in their language, stepping away from contemplating such measures as kicking Russia out of the G8, making it the G7 again. This has been mentioned, talking about boycotting the Sochi Summer Olympics, talking about denying Russia, unambiguously declaring a refusal to negotiate further their entry into the WTO. There's a long list of punitive attempts to punish Russia that has been presented, and I see a much greater reluctance on the part of some allies in NATO to contemplate those measures than other allies. So you're right, it's a simplification in that nobody is talking about a true return to the Cold War style containment, but there's a faction that is talking about far more vigorous response, and far less inclined to defer to Russian sensibilities in this matter, far more willing to risk a potential further souring of the relationship with Russia, versus the crowd that says, we need Russia to solve so many of the problems that we face, including Iran, including possible proliferation of nuclear weapons and materials from the post-Soviet space, including many other issues, North Korea, proliferation, so on and so forth. And therefore, we can't risk that on this issue. So I think there are fairly two distinct camps, although I admit that putting them in those two categories might be something of a simplification.
I just wanted to say a word, though, about Georgia and NATO membership. Obviously, as you mentioned, the pipelines are critical. There's no question about that. But I think you also need to keep in mind that the idea of the new Silk Road, there's an awful lot of transportation of goods, people, services, that Georgia is in a very, very central location. Again, if you look at a map, it always has been, the sort of the east-west corridor. So I think it's far more than simply, the oil and gas, as important as that is. But another very important thing, and whether you like it or not, I'm just simply going to cite a fact, and that is both in particularly in Afghanistan, almost every flight that goes to Afghanistan, from Western Europe, either overflies or refuels, in Georgia. And Georgia has taken on, for that reason, for the military planners, for the broader thinkers, a significance that, is much more than, a small little country, in the Caucasus. And I don't diminish the fact that, again, Heidi, even though you were very critical of Saakashvili, and for reasons, that I some share myself, Georgia was and still is, more advanced in terms of, moving towards a market economy. There's plenty of corruption there. There's still plenty of bad issues. But when you look at the neighborhood, as a whole, Georgia looks, pretty doggone good. And I don't dismiss that as a factor, in terms of, why we are so interested in Georgia. Yep.
How do you see this conflict affecting, it's been touched on a little bit, but how do you see this conflict affecting the missiles being placed in Poland and that issue which Russia has been strongly opposed to?
Bill?
Well, the recent reports are that one of the sticking issues in that agreement was the Polish request for Patriot missiles, which would be missiles for the air defense of Poland itself. The purpose of the stated purpose of the missiles, and I have no reason to doubt that this is their real purpose at all. I don't belong to this camp that we find in Russia of suspicion regarding these missiles. The purpose of these missiles primarily is to serve against a possible threat from Iran, their flight path that would come from Iran, and not to deal with the thousands of delivery-capable Russian weapons. But the Poles had wanted to have something that was not just for the United States and and other allies, but they wanted to have something for the Poles. And the U.S., after this event, apparently the American side agreed to their request in the days after this event. So this would be an example of what Ambassador Yalowitz is suggesting, that the Russian move could end up redounding to their disadvantage if you see more action like this, namely stiffening the behavior of some of Russia's adversaries or interlocutors on the international scene. So it did seem to have had a material effect on the negotiations with Poland.
Yeah.
As we were talking about before about how Russia is attempting to remain in control of the security of their particular region. How does this conflict with Georgia, or how does it affect the public opinion or the opinions of the surrounding countries in that area and their policies towards Georgia if Russia is if Russia is controlling so much of that region?
Well, again, I think it does present them with a starker choice than they have had in the past. However, I want to stress, this struggle has been going on. It's been sometimes called, I think, romantically but misleadingly, the Great Game. This kind of competition for influence among great powers in the post-Soviet space, and particularly in Central Asia. It's been going on for a long time, and so far, it says the competition for influence over these regimes has been going on for a long time. An important episode in this competition happened after 9/11, where the United States negotiated, with some support from Moscow, agreements with some Central Asian states to station forces in support of its operations in Afghanistan, as large military bases were set up. And Russia sort of methodically and persistently, although it cooperated in some aspects of this operation, methodically and persistently worked to diminish the geopolitical significance of this deployment until ultimately today it has won back into its security and economic ambit most of the countries that people were formerly worried in Moscow were formerly worried would somehow become U.S. allies in the region. So the countries of this region are used to playing a delicate game of ambiguity in their geopolitical orientation. Countries like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, routinely kind of are playing both sides. This event in Georgia, I think, will alter their calculations to shade their ambiguity slightly in favor of Russia. I doubt it will mean a decisive break with the West, rather a shading of their carefully calculated ambiguous policies more in the favor of Moscow.
And I do agree with Bill completely. It's been very interesting. Countries like Azerbaijan, I think, have been very quiet so far. And I think that it's an indication that, that they are, at least for the time being, if there's been a shift in the correlation of forces, it's certainly been towards Moscow. And no doubt about that. We have time. I just want to be sure we get all students. If any other students want to ask questions, yeah, you had your hand up.
Real briefly, you mentioned the defense of Georgia and the defense forces, and being that our governments, Georgia and the United States, have definitely been getting closer, and they've committed a significant amount of troops to Iraq. I'm curious why we haven't helped their military, or why the military was so feckless in this whole fiasco.
Well, one thing I would have to say is the Georgians, as much as I like the Georgians are not great fighters. When you look at the South Caucasus, the Chechens are ferocious. And believe me, that story is not fully written yet. That story is still to be completed. The Karabakhis in Nagorno-Karabakh are also very fierce fighters. The Georgians, the Georgians are very interesting. During the Tsarist regime and even later, produced great generals. Lots of the great generals were Georgians, but as fighting forces, unfortunately, they did not equip themselves terribly well, either in Abkhazia or South Ossetia. I mean, there was a ragtag forces that went there, but they didn't do well. They didn't do very well in 1998 when there was another outbreak of hostilities in Abkhazia, and again, they did not do very well. We went in to really support the Georgian military, not to help them retake Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It was done after 9/11, and primarily because of a factor that Professor Wohlforth mentioned earlier. There's an area of Georgia called the Pankisi Gorge, where a number of Chechens who fled Russia from earlier Chechen wars 150 years ago settled. And when the Russians came back into Chechnya in force in 1999 in the Second Chechen War, again, 6,000 Chechens appeared on the Georgian border and requested, admission as refugees. And I remember our government, I was there as ambassador at the time, pressed the Georgians to take them in as a humanitarian gesture. They did, but they brought all these new Chechens and put them in the Pankisi Gorge with the people who had arrived, 100 years before. And the mixture was combustible. The two groups did not get along. But also the factor that you mentioned, clearly amongst those 6,000, there were some fighters. And there were fighters that went back and forth. The border is completely impassable in the winter. It's just, 15,000 feet up. But in the spring, there were fighters that went back and forth. And the Russians kept saying and arguing, that unless they could go in there and take out these Chechen fighters, that they weren't going to be able to win the war, and that was the only thing that was preventing them from doing so. That's why they asked for permission to use their bases, and attack into Chechnya, but they also wanted to go into the Pankisi Gorge. The Georgians said no, and it wasn't, however, though, until a couple of years later, which was after 9/11, that some of the fighters from Afghanistan, the defeated fighters, made their way to the Pankisi Gorge, not in large numbers, but made their way there. I think, U.S. and other intelligence, confirmed the presence of these people, and it was then that we started putting a lot more pressure on the Georgians, to take action to retake control of the Pankisi Gorge. And it was then that we started doing the train and equip program, because it was also designed to tell the Russians, don't you come in, because that had been our policy, to the Russians, you don't come in here, let the Georgians do it. And then when, as I said, when it was found out that there were bad elements in Pankisi from the Taliban, then we upped the ante. We ended up training, Georgian Ranger troops. We ended up doing quite a bit more. That was the beginning, of the real U.S. effort to retrain and equip some of the Georgian forces. But for the most part, the equipment that the Georgians have bought has not been from the United States. It's been from other countries. And a lot of their equipment, when you compare it, to the Russians, it's puny. They have a mild, very tiny Air Force, very tiny, their military maybe 25 or 30,000 people. I mean, it's absolutely nothing. So that's why when I said earlier, I think the Georgians are going to have to study why they went in force into Skin Valley, knowing that their forces, are weak, and anticipating that the Russians were probably going to clobber them is a question I don't have answered yet, and I'd like to see that answered, because militarily there is no way that they could have dealt with the Russians. Whether their calculation was that we would come in, that NATO would come in, I don't know. That was always a concern of mine, that in sort of equipping and training the Georgians, that they might someday do something, like this. And this was my worst fear confirmed. It's exactly what happened. Yeah.
So a lot of opinion pieces are talking about the Georgians going into self-accession because of the belief that the U.S. would be supportive. So I guess my question to you is, all of you guys, one, how legitimate of a connection is that? Do you guys actually think that kind of the U.S. promises encourage the Georgians to be aggressive? And two, regardless of that, we've got lots of places where we've made, where we have allies that are even slightly precarious situations. I mean, Taiwan comes to mind. And if we're not going to be willing to put kind of hard capital, either economic sanctions or military action on the ground, what do you guys think we should do as far as making kind of these alliances with weaker states in the region?
Well, the first thing I would say to that is, Georgia is not a treaty ally. And that point was made very clear to the Georgians over and over and over again. I wasn't in these meetings, but I know for a fact, that at the highest level, the Georgians were told, basically, if you go into one of these two places, don't expect us to come and rescue you. That's not to say that there were not other messages, that came out of our government. One thing that you'll learn if you ever go into foreign policy as a diplomat or professional in the area in government, we do not always speak, with one voice, believe me. And there was a very good article in the New York Times on Monday suggesting that there were, some conflicting signals that perhaps Cheney and others, were indicating to the Georgians, we'll be with you. And I can tell you also that was one of the things that worried me very much when I was in Georgia. There were two sides to it. One was the Georgian sense that they were so important that they could not fail. And that two, that in the end, when push came to shove, that we would come and rescue them. No matter what was said, no matter who said it, there was the sense that they were simply too, important to fail. Whether and how much that was a factor, in their decision making, I don't know. That's why I say for the Georgians, I think it's imperative that they study this, because they obviously can't afford, to do something like this again. But I think they're going to have to learn and study sort of how this decision was made, what their calculations were, where their intelligence was wrong, and what their assumptions were, because I think they've really got a lot to study here. Over the longer term, as I suggested earlier, what I would like to see happen is I would like to see more efforts made to encourage and improve the defensive capabilities of these countries. A commitment was made to Georgia and Ukraine, and as I said, you can debate this either way. I happen to believe that if a country, if its population wants to join NATO, as the Georgians clearly do, and if they qualify, I think one could argue, and some have, that we brought in Romania and Bulgaria perhaps too quickly, and that there's been some backsliding, and that that you really ought to be very careful, and I support that. I mean, if Georgia is to get into NATO, they have to meet all the criteria. But as I say, that is out there, that remains out there as a possibility. But short of that, there's a program called the NATO Partnership for Peace, which could be strengthened, to improve the defensive capabilities, of these countries. And I guess what I'm suggesting here is, I'm no neoconservative, but there is, I think, a deterrence factor here, that if their capabilities, were improved, it might, cause someone who wants to intimidate and militarily threaten these countries, to think twice about it.
You can't though enter NATO if you have an ongoing border conflict. So that's all predicated upon the resolution of this.
And that's another reason why, as I say, some have suggested that, you know, the Russians were provoking this basically to demonstrate that Georgia was unqualified, you know, to. So you've got a situation where you've got criteria to join NATO, but are you going to allow the Russians basically to dictate those criteria? So there are lots of issues here that are going to have to be dealt with. Not easy issues at all.
Can I ask you, how much defense do you think that Georgia would have to have in order to create a credible deterrent to Russia? I mean, is that worth expending American effort on? Why doesn't it just create a larger conflict than what we have right now?
Yeah, well, that's a valid point.
At what point does it actually stop the conflict?
Yeah, no, as I said, you've got a number of conflicting principles, you know, that are at play here, and I'm not sure. I don't know. And certainly in the post-Cold War, I think we're now faced with lots of new issues and perhaps a new paradigm here, and it's a very legitimate issue, and I accept it. Yona, I think you're gonna. Oh yeah, I think we'll make this the last question. Yona.
I'm interested in the related suggestion that you made about trying to strengthen relationships between the countries, the neighboring countries in the South Caucasus and in Central Asia, maybe, by improving perhaps their diplomatic relations. There doesn't seem to be much communication going on between these regimes right now, but you mentioned it just briefly, and I thought I understood that you took that to be a crucial point in a crucial solution possibly.
Yeah, it's something that we worked for, that we tried to do, but in the South Caucasus, the Azeris refused to work with the Armenians as long as, you know, there are Armenians, you know, sitting in Nagorno-Karabakh. In Central Asia, it's going to be very hard to do very much with Uzbekistan right now. Kazakhstan is a critical country. We haven't even mentioned Kazakhstan. It's a very wealthy country, and they're very much sitting on the fence. They have a lot of oil and gas to get out. There are many who hope that a lot of that oil and gas will be shipped through the east-west pipelines. The Russians hope, you know, it will go north. And those are the countries, those are the bellwethers. I think that, you know, that's why I say I think we're in a new situation now to see where and what kinds of decisions, you know, countries like Kazakhstan, you know, make, and even Azerbaijan. This is going to be very important. I think lot's going to depend on the reaction, you know, and how, you know, we go to help Georgia, on what terms, how much, you know, we provide. What the nature of the support is, and there are going to be some very, very tough issues, as Bill described. There's some very significant differences, you know, in NATO about what we ought to be doing there and what our interests are. And this is going to be something that for the next administration, I mean, my basic argument to the next administration is you're going to have to start paying attention to this region. You know, we neglected it, and this is what we got. That's my basic concern. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks.